The fog hides more than footsteps tonight. It hides intent. Welcome to Mystery Files. I am your host, Raven. Before we proceed, leave a comment with where you're listening from. I truly enjoy seeing your messages. You're always welcome here. Let's enter the case. It is one of those peculiar ironies of London that the very fog which lends our city its romance also serves, at times, as a cloak for the most prosaic wickedness. In the winter of '89, when the soot lay thick upon the window ledges of Baker Street and the gas lamps shone like pale coins in a sea of grey, there occurred a sequence of events so singular and so artfully concealed beneath the ordinary habits of the metropolis that I should have hesitated to set them down at all, had I not lived them at Mr. Sherlock Holmes's elbow. When I'd returned from a brisk round of morning calls to find Holmes in that attitude of rigid stillness which, to the uninitiated, suggests ennui, but which I had long since learned to associate with the most active labour of his mind. He stood at the window of our sitting room, his hands clasped behind him, his head slightly bowed, as though listening to something beyond the reach of common ears. The street below was a shifting smear of shadow. Even the opposite houses appeared to recede and advance, swallowed and released by the fog in slow breaths. "You are late, Watson," said he, without turning. I confess I did not imagine my punctuality would be measurable through 2 inches of pain and half a mile of coal smoke, I returned, hanging my coat upon the peg. Holmes's thin smile came and went like the flicker of a match. Punctuality is a habit, and habits have tells. Your step upon the second stair was shorter. That suggests fatigue. Yet your cheeks are flushed, which suggests exertion. You have been walking fast, but with a mind elsewhere. You have, therefore, received news on your rounds that has disturbed you. I stared, as I always did at such performances, with that mingled irritation and admiration which is the portion of every man who lives beside genius. If you must know, I met Stamford by chance at Charing Cross. He spoke of a patient of his. An odd case. Stamford. Holmes turned at last, his eyes brightening. A general practitioner with a taste for gossip and an unfortunate fondness for peppermint lozenges. He chewed them this morning. He did, I admitted. And he told you of something he did not understand, Holmes went on, or as if completing a line of music, which you, being a physician of sound training, are curious to hear explained. Sit down, my dear fellow, and spare me the preamble. The fog is in a mood to bring us business. Before I could comply, there came a brisk knock at the door, followed almost instantly by Mrs. Hudson's gentle voice. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says it is urgent." Holmes's glance darted to the mantel clock. 9 minutes early, he murmured. "Bring him up, Mrs. Hudson." The visitor who entered was not, at first sight, a gentleman of the sort one associates with urgent calls upon consulting detectives. He was a man of perhaps 40, stout without being gross, dressed in a heavy black coat whose nap shone with damp. His hat was held in both hands as though it were a fragile thing. The most striking feature, however, and was his face, waxen, strained and damp not only with fog, but with a fine perspiration of anxiety. His eyes moved continually, as if the room itself might shift and betray him. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he began, with an effort. "At your service," said Holmes, indicating the chair. "And this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. You are Mr. Elias Hargreaves, Secretary to the Board of Works Subcommittee on Street Illumination and Gas Regulation." The man half rose and sank again. "Good God! Then it is true what they say." "How?" Holmes waved a thin hand. "The ink stain upon your left cuff is the particular violet of the board's correspondence. The abrasion on your right thumb is from sealing wax. Cheap wax, the sort purchased in bulk for public offices. Your coat has been brushed too often and in too great haste for a man of leisure. Yes, and you have that unhappy look of one who has to carry other men's secrets. Tell me now what has happened." Mr. Hargreaves swallowed. His lips were dry. It is not only what has happened, Mr. Holmes. It is what is going to happen unless you stop it." Holmes leaned forward a fraction, like a hound catching scent. "Proceed." "2 nights ago," said Hargreaves, "a man died on Thames Street. He was found with his face in the gutter, as if he had simply fallen. There was no blood, no wound, nothing to suggest violence. Yet he was dead, and his skin was—" He hesitated, searching for a word, grey, like a candle left too long in smoke. "A collapse," I suggested. "A seizure, perhaps." "That is what the constable thought," Hargreaves answered. "And the doctor who came said heart failure and wrote it down with a shrug. But Mr. Holmes, as the man who died was not the sort to collapse in a gutter." "And who was he?" Holmes asked softly. "Mr. Percival Slate," Hargreaves replied. "A clerk attached to the board's accounts office. Quiet, reliable. The last man you would think to find in a place like Thames Street at midnight?" Holmes's eyelids flickered. "Midnight?" "Yes," said Hargreaves, and his fingers tightened upon his hat. "And that is not all. When they searched him, they found a folded paper in his breast pocket. Not money, not a letter. A slip torn from a larger sheet, with only a few words left upon it." Holmes held out his hand. "You have it." Hargreaves stared at him in astonishment. "How could you know?" "Because you would not have come here with mere hearsay," Holmes replied. "And because you keep touching your inner pocket as you speak, you're like a man reassuring himself that a weapon remains within reach." With trembling fingers, Hargreaves produced a paper, carefully smoothed as though it were already precious. Holmes took it delicately, held it to the light, and I saw at once that it was not ordinary notepaper. It was thick, with a watermark faintly visible when turned. Holmes read it once in silence, then again, even more slowly. He passed it to me without a word. The message, written in a cramped hand, consisted of 5 words: "Keep to the fog, or else." That was all. No signature, no date, no address. "A threat," I said. Holmes did not answer at once. He had turned the paper over, examining the torn edge, the fibers, and the pressure of the pen strokes. His nostrils flared slightly as if he were testing an odor. At last he looked up. "Tell me everything, Mr. Hargreaves," said he, "and omit nothing because it seems absurd. It is the absurdities which are most often the hinge of truth." Hargreaves drew a shaking breath. "Yesterday morning there was fog, thick as I have ever seen it, the sort that muffles the hooves and makes a man's own breath sound like someone else's behind him. At 11 o'clock, our office received a sealed envelope addressed to me personally. It bore no stamp and no postmark. Someone must have brought it in by hand." "And inside?" asked Holmes. "A piece of the same paper," Hargreaves whispered, "and the words, 2 more before Sunday." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Before Sunday," he repeated. "And today is Friday," as I said, glancing at the calendar. Hargreaves nodded miserably. "2 more, Mr. Holmes. 2 more deaths, unless something is done." And I went to Scotland Yard. Inspector Lestrade listened, smiled, and said I had been reading too many penny dreadfuls. He told me a clerk's death in a gutter is unfortunate, but hardly a conspiracy. He advised me to sleep. Holmes's mouth twitched at the name of Lestrade, though whether in affection or contempt I could never quite decide. "Lestrade is a useful man," said he, "but his imagination is as regulated as his office hours. You did well to come here." Hargreaves leaned forward, his voice dropping. "There is something else. Mr. Slate was working on a set of figures. Gas contracts, Mr. Holmes. Street illumination. Payments to private suppliers. He mentioned discrepancies. He was a cautious man, sir. But he hinted that someone was siphoning funds, large sums, through false invoices." Holmes's fingers steepled beneath his chin. and he was found dead in the fog, with a warning to keep to the fog. Yes. Hargreaves looked as if he might be sick. I swear to you I did not understand it, but when I received that second message I thought, God help me, I thought the fog itself was part of it. Holmes rose, moved to the window, and pulled aside the curtain. Outside, Baker Street was a ghostly corridor. A hansom cab drifted by like a shadow on water. Somewhere, unseen, a bell clanged distantly, and the sound was swallowed almost at once. The fog is always part of it, Holmes said quietly, when men have something to hide. He turned back to us with that sudden, electric certainty I had seen in him at the threshold of many a case. Yet there was something in his expression now that I could not name, an alertness edged with displeasure, as though an old enemy had stepped onto the board. Mr. Hargreaves, said he, you will do 3 things. First, you will return to your office and behave as though you had done nothing unusual. Second, you will tell no one, no superior, no clerk, no constable, that you have come to me. Third, you will give me the name of every man who had access to Slate's figures. Hargreaves blinked. But, Mr. Holmes, if there are to be 2 more... Holmes's eyes, cold and clear, met his. Then we must see who benefits from haste and who benefits from silence. Dr. Watson and I will visit Thames Street before noon, and I will speak with the doctor who wrote Heart Failure, with a shrug. I should like, also, to examine the exact place where Slate fell. He crossed to the table, took up his coat and hat with the briskness of a man who has at last been offered a proper problem, and in so doing brushed his fingers against the coal scuttle. A thin black dust clung to his glove. He paused, held his hand to the light, and smiled very faintly. London, he murmured, is a city built upon smoke and secrets. Let us see which of them prefers the fog. I confess that as I watched him prepare, a chill went through me which was not due wholly to the winter air. There was something in the messages, something in the phrasing, in the very boldness of predicting death before Sunday, that suggested not mere greed, but a mind that took pleasure in control. And when Holmes grows quiet in the presence of such a mind, it is wise for the rest of us to listen. But we stepped out into Baker Street together, and at once the fog closed round us like a living thing. Somewhere ahead, a man coughed, once, twice, and the sound seemed oddly near, as though the city itself were clearing its throat to speak. Holmes walked a pace before me, head slightly turned, attentive not only to what could be seen, but to what could not. "Watson," he said without looking back, "do you smell it?" "Smell what?" I asked, inhaling the damp and coal-laden air. He slowed. "Not only coal," said he. "There is another note beneath it, faint but distinct. Our conspiracy, my dear fellow, has already left its trace upon the wind." Holmes did not wait for my answer. He moved with that swift, economical stride of his, the collar of his coat turned up against the damp, his eyes narrowed as though he would pierce the vapor by sheer concentration. I followed close, my medical bag swinging against my knee, for I had learned that when Holmes detected an odor no other man perceived, it was often the first thread of a tapestry that would later astonish me in its completeness. We had not gone 50 yards when he halted so abruptly that I all but collided with him. He bent, gloved fingers hovering over the cobbles near the curb, and then straightened again without touching anything. "Not coal," he murmured, "and not ordinary street gas." "You mean you recognized it?" I asked. "I recognize its family," said he. "There are smells which belong to commerce and smells which belong to chemistry. This is not the honest stink of a factory, nor the familiar sulphurous taint that clings to the poorer lanes. As it is refined. Someone has taken the trouble to distill their mischief." As he spoke, a shape emerged from the fog. A constable, lantern held high, his face a pale oval beneath the helmet. He slowed when he saw Holmes, and I recognized the quick change in his bearing. the half-proud, half-suspicious awareness that he stood before a man who was neither gentleman nor official, and yet seemed somehow to command both worlds. "Morning, officer," Holmes said pleasantly. "A thick one, eh?" "Aye, sir," the man replied. "Bad as I've seen. They say it sits on the river like a blanket." "They say many things," Holmes returned. "Tell me, have you had any reports from Thames Street since midnight?" The constable's eyes sharpened. "No more deaths, if that's what you mean. But there's been talk. Now, the woman swears she saw a man stagger out of the fog near the Custom House steps. Said he moved like he was blind, clutching his throat. By the time she fetched help, there was naught there but the mist." Holmes's smile remained, but his gaze became intent. "And this woman, did she mention any smell?" The constable frowned as though the question offended his sense of propriety. "Smell? Only the fog, sir, though she did say it made her eyes water." Holmes thanked him and moved on, leaving the man blinking after us. When we had gone a little distance, I ventured, "A man clutching his throat, choking. Some irritant gas, perhaps?" Holmes's eyes flicked to me approvingly. "Your profession does not render you useless, Watson. Yes, an irritant, or something subtler. We shall not speculate in the street. Speculation is for the idle, so as we shall gather facts." A hansom cab loomed out of the greyness like an apparition. Holmes hailed it with a sharp whistle, gave the driver our destination, and we were soon rattling through a London reduced to shadows. The familiar landmarks passed as vague outlines. A lamppost here, a shop front there, blurred and distorted, as if the city had become a half-remembered dream. At Thames Street the fog thickened, or else my nerves did. The air tasted different, still cold and damp, but with an added sharpness that sat on the tongue like metal. Holmes inhaled once, slowly, and his nostrils quivered. "There," he said softly. "Stronger." He led me along the pavement, past warehouse doors and darkened windows, until we came to a shallow gutter running beside the curb. There was nothing dramatic to mark the spot. No blood, and no chalk circle, only the ordinary filth of a working street. Yet Holmes stopped as if he had reached the very center of the map. "Here," he said. "How can you be sure?" I asked. Holmes glanced to the wall. A faint, irregular smear, so slight I might have taken it for damp, caught the light of a nearby lamp. "A man falling does not always strike the ground cleanly," said Holmes. "Sometimes he brushes the surface first. Observe the height of that mark, the angle. He slid, not collapsed, straight down, and his shoulder, his right shoulder, touched before his face. He crouched, peering at the gutter. For a moment he was utterly still, and then his fingers darted out, not to touch the mud, but to pluck from it a tiny object no larger than a grain of rice. "A fragment of cork," he remarked, holding it between thumb and forefinger. "Waterlogged, but not long soaked, and, interesting, impregnated." He raised it to his nostrils, sniffed, and his expression hardened. "Watson," he said, "do you carry ammonia?" "I do," I replied at once, and produced the small bottle from my bag. Holmes uncorked it and held it briefly beneath his nose. "Good. Keep it ready. If my guess is correct, we may need it before the day is out." "Holmes," I began, but he silenced me with a glance. Footsteps sounded, heavy, purposeful, and through the fog came Inspector Lestrade, his coat buttoned up and his jaw set in that familiar line of irritated duty. "Holmes," he called, with the air of a man who resents even the necessity of speaking the name. "I might have known you'd poke your nose in." Holmes rose. "Lestrade, always a pleasure. I trust you have not been sleeping as you advised Mr. Aunt Hargreaves to do." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "So the little secretary's been flapping to you, has he? Typical. These office fellows see a shadow and think it's Napoleon. Slate was a clerk. He keeled over. There's your case." "And the anonymous letter predicting 2 more deaths." Holmes asked mildly. Lestrade's mouth tightened. Prank or blackmail? There's always a crank with a pen when there's fog in London. We've had a dozen such notes in the past year. Holmes's gaze remained steady. Then you will not object if I ask to see the report from the physician who attended the body? I might, said Lestrade, though less firmly than he had intended. Holmes stepped closer, and though his voice was quiet, it carried that precise authority which even hardened policemen find difficult to ignore. Inspector, Jans, you may take credit for this case if it pleases you. You may write your report in capital letters, but if there is a murderer abroad who can kill without a knife or a pistol, you will not wish to be the man who dismissed him as fog-mad fancy. Lestrade hesitated, his pride warring with prudence. At last he jerked his head. All right. The doctor's name is Halloway. He's got a surgery off Lower Thames. Wrote it up as syncope, heart stoppage. But I tell you, Holmes, you'll find nothing but a weak heart and a street too cold. Holmes gave a little bow. We shall see. As Lestrade strode away, Holmes turned again to the gutter. He produced a handkerchief, folded it carefully, and pressed it to the stones where the smear lay. When he lifted it, there was no visible stain, yet he studied it as if it were a colored map. Holmes, what is it? I asked at last, unable to contain myself. He tucked the handkerchief into an envelope. A residue. Perhaps a vapor condensed by the cold stones. Perhaps a liquid that became vapor. Either way, it is evidence. He walked a few paces, eyes scanning the wall and pavement. Suddenly, he stopped beside a drain grating and knelt again. The fog swirled, and for an instant the lamplight revealed the faintest of marks on the iron. Scratches, as though something had been fixed there and then removed. Ah, he said softly, almost to himself. So that is how you did it. My heart gave a strange little leap, for I knew that tone. It was the voice of Holmes when a pattern began to emerge, not complete, but undeniable. You see, I pressed. I see a method, said he. Not yet a man. Not yet a motive. But method is the skeleton upon which motive hangs its flesh. We left the River Aire and pushed through the fog toward Dr. Halloway's surgery. Twice I heard coughing near us and saw no one. Once a cart clattered past, driver invisible, the wheels seeming to roll of their own accord. The city felt unnaturally alive, as if the fog were not merely weather but an accomplice. At last we reached a narrow building with a frosted glass door. Inside, the smell of carbolic and damp wool fought with the scent that had troubled Holmes. A bell tinkled as we entered, and a thin man with spectacles looked up from behind a desk. Dr. Halloway? Holmes asked. I am he, said the man, eyeing Holmes's coat and my medical bag. If this is about Slate, I've already told the police. Holmes's manner was courteous, but his eyes were merciless. Then you will not object to telling me, Doctor, precisely what you observed. Not what you concluded. What you observed. Halloway pursed his lips. The man was dead when I arrived. No wound, no bruising beyond the ordinary. Pupils dilated, lips slightly bluish. A smell. He stopped, frowning. A faint smell like something sharp. I thought it might be the river. Holmes's head lifted. Sharp, he repeated. And did your own eyes water, Doctor? Halloway blinked. Now that you mention it, yes. The fog was devilish. It stung. Holmes took a step forward. And in the man's hands, under his nails. Anything? Halloway's gaze dropped, searching his memory. He had a bit of grit on his right palm, as if he'd scraped something, but I saw no reason to note it. Holmes's expression did not change, yet I felt the room grow colder. You saw no reason, he said softly, to note a man's last action. The doctor colored. Aye, there are many deaths, mister. Holmes, said my friend, and you will do me a kindness, Doctor. You will show me your notes, every line. As Holloway rose reluctantly and went to a cabinet, Holmes turned to me and spoke under his breath, his voice a thread of urgency. "Watson," he said, "our killer does not strike with steel. He strikes with air, and London, with her fog and her gas lamps, provides him the perfect theatre. The question is, who controls the stage machinery?" Before I could answer, the doctor returned with a ledger in his hands, and at the same moment, from the street outside, there came a sudden commotion, hurried footsteps, a shout muffled by fog, and then a cry, short, raw, then cut off as if a hand had closed over a mouth. Holmes's eyes flashed. He snatched his hat from the chair and was at the door in a bound. "Come, Watson," he snapped. "That, if I am not mistaken, is the next death trying to happen." Holmes flung open the surgery door and plunged into the fog with such velocity that I had barely time to seize my bag before following. The cry had come from our left, near the bend where Lower Thames Street narrowed toward a row of warehouses. Shapes loomed and dissolved in the shifting grey. A cartwheel emerged, like a phantom moon, and vanished again. "There," Holmes called. Through the murk I discerned a figure swaying beside a lamp-post. A man, middle-aged, in a clerk's dark coat, staggered as though intoxicated. His hands clawed at his throat. Even at a distance I saw the peculiar stiffness in his limbs, and the uncoordinated flailing that spoke not of drink but of distress. Holmes reached him first. "Stand back," he commanded a pair of startled dock workers who had paused nearby. "Watson!" I was at his side in an instant. The man's eyes were streaming. His face had taken on that dreadful ashen hue I had seen in cases of severe asphyxia. His lips were tinged blue. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse rasp emerged. "Ammonia," Holmes said sharply. I uncorked the bottle and held it beneath the man's nostrils. He recoiled faintly, his breath coming in shallow, desperate pulls. Holmes drew him 2 paces away from the lamp-post and closer to the center of the street, where a slight current of air stirred the fog. "Deep breaths," I urged, supporting the man's shoulders. "Slowly now." For a moment I feared we were too late. His knees buckled, and Holmes caught him under the arm with surprising strength. Then gradually the spasmodic clutching of his hands eased. The color returned faintly to his cheeks. He blinked, bewildered. "You are safe," Holmes said, his tone unexpectedly gentle. "For the moment," the dock workers muttered among themselves. One crossed himself. "It's the fog," he whispered. "Cursed stuff." Holmes's gaze flicked to the lamp-post. "Watson, keep him steady." He moved swiftly toward the iron base, crouched, and ran his gloved fingers along the metal. I saw him pause at a point some 4 feet above the ground, his head inclined, listening rather than looking. "Just as before," he murmured. "What is it?" I demanded. "Absence," said Holmes. The most eloquent of signs." He drew from his pocket the small cork fragment we had recovered earlier and held it up against the lamp-post's bracket. His eyes narrowed. "Watson," he said quietly. "Observe the screws. Fresh scratches. Something has been fixed here recently, light enough to escape notice, strong enough to hold." "A canister?" I suggested, my mind leaping to the obvious. "Precisely," he replied. "A small vessel, perhaps glass, perhaps thin metal, corked and pierced. When the fog is thick, the vapor would hang low, almost invisible, until disturbed by a passer-by. A simple contrivance, deadly in its effect." The man we had revived stirred weakly. I was only walking to the counting-house," he stammered. Then my eyes burned. I could not see. Holmes returned to us. "Your name, sir?" "Arthur Bellamy," he managed. "Oh, junior clerk, Dyer and Son." Holmes's glance sharpened. "And have you, Mr. Bellamy, had occasion recently to examine any ledgers pertaining to municipal contracts? Gas supplies, perhaps?" Bellamy stared. Yes, sir. We audit invoices for several departments. I was reviewing accounts for the Board of Works this week. Holmes and I exchanged a look. The thread tightened. You will come with us to Dr. Halloway's surgery, Holmes said. You have had a narrow escape. Bellamy needed little persuasion. Supported between us, he stumbled back through the fog. Already the lamp-post behind us had vanished from sight, swallowed by grey silence, as though it had never stood there at all. Inside the surgery, Dr. Halloway exclaimed in alarm at our return with a second victim. I explained briefly while Holmes laid Bellamy upon the examination couch. The doctor listened, incredulous at first, then increasingly pale as he examined the man's inflamed eyes and irritated throat. There is no natural cause for this, Halloway admitted at last. It resembles exposure to a caustic vapor, something volatile. Holmes inclined his head. You observed a similar irritation in Mr. Slate? Halloway hesitated. His eyes were red, yes. I attributed it to the fog. Holmes's lips tightened. London fog does not single out clerks connected to gas contracts. Lestrade burst in moments later, drawn by the commotion. His expression darkened when he saw Bellamy on the couch. Another collapse? He demanded. Another attempt, Holmes corrected. Fortunately interrupted. Lestrade folded his arms. And you think this is murder? I think, said Holmes evenly, that someone has devised a method of dispersing a noxious substance at street level, relying upon the fog to mask both sight and scent. 2 men connected to the same sphere of municipal finance have been targeted. 1 dead, 1 nearly so. That exceeds coincidence. Lestrade frowned, his confidence wavering. You've proof? Holmes stepped close and lowered his voice. I've scratches upon iron where a device was fixed. I have a fragment of cork impregnated with a chemical residue. I have a second victim whose symptoms mirror those of the first. If that is insufficient for you, Inspector, then wait for Sunday. Lestrade's jaw worked. All right, suppose you're right. Why not shoot them? Why this fancy contraption? Holmes's eyes gleamed. That's because a bullet leaves a wound. A knife leaves blood, but a man who collapses in the fog invites no inquiry. His death is the weather's fault. Silence fell. Even Lestrade could not deny the logic. Holmes turned to Bellamy, who had recovered enough to sit upright. You will remain indoors for the next 48 hours, he instructed. Avoid the streets after dusk, and you will provide me with the names of every superior who has access to the ledgers you examined. Bellamy nodded fervently. When he had been settled and arrangements made for his safe conveyance home, Holmes stepped aside with me near the surgery window. You see the pattern? He asked softly. I see that 2 clerks have been attacked, I replied, both connected with irregularities in gas accounts. Just so, Holmes said. And the method implicates someone with knowledge not merely of chemistry, but of street infrastructure. The lampposts are not public toys, Watson. To affix a device without detection suggests familiarity, perhaps authority. You think the conspiracy lies within the board itself? Holmes's gaze drifted toward the fog outside. Conspiracy is a grand word. Often it is merely greed, cloaked in procedure. If funds are being siphoned through false invoices, those who detect it must be silenced. Quietly, elegantly. And the warning? I pressed. 2 more before Sunday. Holmes' expression grew thoughtful. A flourish, or a schedule. Before I could inquire further, a young constable entered hurriedly, cap askew. Inspector, he called to Lestrade. Message from headquarters. Now there's been a report. Another man found unconscious near Bishopsgate. Same sort of complaint, eyes burning, breathing bad. Lestrade swore under his breath. Holmes did not. He merely reached for his coat once more. Then our adversary grows bold, he said, or impatient. He paused at the door and looked back at me, and in his eyes I saw not excitement but calculation, a swift assembling of pieces upon a mental board. Watson, he said quietly, We are no longer dealing with a threat of 2 more deaths. We are in the midst of the execution of a plan, and unless we discover who controls these invisible weapons, London herself becomes the accomplice. He stepped into the fog again, and I followed, acutely aware that somewhere in that grey expanse a mind as cold and deliberate as Holmes's own was already preparing its next move. And we had scarcely advanced 20 paces from the surgery when Holmes altered his course. "Not Bishopsgate," he said abruptly. Lestrade, who had been striding ahead with officious determination, stopped short. "What?" "Inspector," Holmes continued evenly, "if our man is repeating his method, he will not choose a crowded thoroughfare at random. He will choose a position calculated to intercept a specific target." "You heard the constable," Lestrade snapped. "Bishopsgate." "I heard that a man was found there," Holmes replied. "That does not mean the device was fixed there. Consider, our previous attempts were upon streets bordering the river and commercial houses. Clerks, auditors, men of figures. Bishopsgate leads toward the financial district. It is likely that our intended victim was en route from his office, and not idling beneath a lamp-post for pleasure." Lestrade's impatience flickered into reluctant curiosity. "So where, then?" Holmes paused, head inclined as though tracing invisible lines across the map of London. "Between Bishopsgate and the cluster of accounting houses off Threadneedle Street. There is a narrow cut-through, St. Helens Lane. Poorly lit, frequently fog-bound in this weather. We shall begin there." Lestrade hesitated only a moment before gesturing to the constable. "You heard him. Come on." I confess I felt a curious sensation then, half admiration, half unease. Holmes did not merely chase events. He anticipated them. It was as if he sought to step into the very rhythm of the unseen adversary's mind. The fog thickened as we approached the city. Gas lamps glowed like distant embers, and their halos barely penetrating the gloom. Foot traffic thinned. Even the usual clatter of carts seemed subdued, absorbed by the damp air. We turned into St. Helens Lane. Holmes slowed instantly. "Careful," he murmured. The lane was narrow, hemmed in by tall brick walls. A single lamp-post stood halfway down, its flame wavering faintly. At first glance there was nothing amiss. Yet Holmes did not look at the ground. He looked upward. "Watson," he said quietly. "The ammonia." I readied the bottle. Holmes approached the lamp-post with deliberate caution, keeping slightly to one side rather than walking directly beneath it. He examined the bracket where the glass enclosure met the iron support. "There," he breathed. I saw it then, a small cylindrical object, no larger than a gentleman's snuff-box, strapped to the inner curve of the post with darkened wire. Its surface was nearly indistinguishable from the iron in the dim light. Lestrade sucked in his breath. "I'll be—" Holmes raised a warning hand. "Do not touch it." He bent, examining the base. A thin cork stopper protruded from the top of the cylinder, pierced by what appeared to be a fine needle or tube. "A timed release?" I asked. "More primitive," Holmes replied. "The fog itself is the accomplice. Moisture saturates the cork. The contents escape gradually. When disturbed by movement or a change in air pressure, say a passerby, the vapor descends." As if in confirmation, a faint acrid scent reached us. My eyes prickled at once. Holmes stepped back swiftly. "Watson!" I waved the ammonia beneath my own nose and then toward Lestrade and the constable. The inspector swore again, this time in alarm. "Can you disable it?" he demanded. Holmes considered the device for a fraction of a second, then withdrew a handkerchief from his pocket, folded it thickly, and with measured precision grasped the cylinder at its base, avoiding the cork. With a firm twist, he detached it from the wire, holding it at arm's length. "Water," he said sharply. The constable dashed toward a nearby doorway, pounding until a startled shopkeeper emerged with a bucket. Holmes lowered the cylinder into the water. A faint hiss rose, followed by silence. Lestrade stared. "You knew it would be there." "I suspected," Holmes corrected, "and I was fortunate that our man had not yet returned to remove it." "You think he comes back?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "He must. These devices are not disposable toys, and they require preparation, cost, and knowledge. He retrieves them to reuse or conceal evidence, and he will do so soon, once the fog thins or his intended victim fails to appear." Lestrade straightened. "Then we wait." Holmes shook his head. "Not idly. Inspector, place 2 men at either end of the lane in plain clothes. Have them appear to loiter. We shall withdraw to a vantage point and observe." Lestrade did not argue. Within minutes the arrangements were made. Holmes and I took shelter in the recessed doorway of a shuttered warehouse opposite the lamp-post. The fog shifted in slow currents, sometimes obscuring the post entirely, sometimes revealing it like a ghostly sentinel. Time stretched. A quarter-hour passed, then another. "Holmes," I whispered, "if he does not come—" "He will," Holmes replied calmly. He cannot afford to leave such evidence behind. Moreover, he believes himself unseen. Confidence breeds repetition." As if summoned by those words, a shape detached itself from the murk at the far end of the lane. A man, tall, spare, wearing a dark overcoat and a hat pulled low. He moved with the purposeful stride of one accustomed to the streets. He did not glance about nervously, as a guilty man might. Instead, he approached the lamp-post with the air of routine. Holmes's hand tightened upon my sleeve. The man halted beneath the lamp, his head tilted upward. For a brief instant I saw confusion stiffen his posture. Then he stepped closer, raising one gloved hand to the bracket, finding nothing. He froze. In that heartbeat of stillness, Holmes moved. I crossed the lane in 3 silent strides and laid a firm hand upon the stranger's shoulder. "I believe," said Holmes pleasantly, "you're searching for something." The man turned sharply. His face, pale in the lamplight, was composed but for a flicker in the eyes, a flash of calculation rather than fear. "I beg your pardon," he said coolly. Lestrade and the constables emerged from either end of the lane, closing the circle. Holmes did not remove his hand. "You attached a small cylindrical device to this lamp-post earlier this afternoon. A device containing a volatile irritant. It is now safely submerged." The man's gaze shifted briefly toward the bucket near the doorway. Only briefly. But Holmes saw it. "I have no idea what you mean," he replied. "On the contrary," Holmes said softly, "you have a very precise idea. That the scratches upon the bracket match the width of the wire in your pocket." The man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Holmes continued, his voice measured. "You have chosen locations frequented by clerks engaged in the examination of gas contracts. 2 have already suffered, 1 fatally. You intended another this evening." Lestrade stepped forward. "Name?" The stranger hesitated only a fraction. "Edwin March," he said, "Assistant Inspector of Street Lighting." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Of course," he murmured. Lestrade's brows shot upward. "Street lighting?" "Yes," Holmes said quietly. "Who better to tamper with lamp-posts unnoticed?" March's composure cracked, but only slightly. "You have no proof," he said. Holmes's gaze was unblinking. "Yes, we shall see what proof remains in your lodgings, and in the accounts you are so eager to protect." At that word, accounts, a flicker of something darker crossed March's face. It was not panic. It was anger. And in that instant, I knew that we had not yet reached the heart of the matter. The anger that flared in Edwin March's eyes was gone almost as swiftly as it had appeared, replaced by a cool detachment that might have passed for innocence in a less observant audience. He drew himself up slightly, as though affronted rather than cornered. "This is absurd," he said. "I supervise the maintenance of public lamps. If there are scratches upon a bracket, it is because I inspect them." Holmes's hand remained lightly upon his shoulder, yet there was no mistaking the iron beneath the courtesy. "Indeed," said he. "And you inspect them at dusk, in heavy fog, when few can see what you affix or remove." March did not answer at once. Instead, he turned his gaze deliberately toward Lestrade. "Inspector, I demand to know under what authority I am detained." Lestrade cleared his throat. "Suspicion of attempted murder will suffice for the moment." March's lip twitched faintly. "On whose word?" "His." He inclined his head toward Holmes. Holmes smiled thinly. "You mistake me, Mr. March. I do not offer words. I offer patterns." He withdrew his hand and stepped back, as though inviting the man to consider the board upon which he stood. "You are Assistant Inspector of Street Lighting," Holmes continued. "You possess knowledge of the lamppost structures, their brackets, their schedules of maintenance. So you know when fog will be thickest along the river and within the narrower lanes of the city. You know the routes by which clerks and auditors depart their offices, and you are uniquely positioned to attach and remove a small device without arousing suspicion." March's composure held, yet I observed that his gloved hands had tightened at his sides. "A remarkable fantasy," he said coolly, "but fantasy nonetheless." Holmes inclined his head. "Perhaps. Let us test it." He turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, before you escort Mr. March away, examine his right coat pocket." March stiffened. "You have no right." Lestrade, emboldened by the presence of his men, reached forward and thrust his hand into the indicated pocket. When he withdrew it, a short coil of thin, darkened wire lay looped across his palm. The lane seemed suddenly quieter, and Holmes's voice remained calm. "The wire bears fresh scoring consistent with the scratches upon the lamppost bracket. It is cut at one end, as though recently detached." March's gaze flicked once more toward the submerged cylinder. For the first time, a trace of calculation faltered. "I carry wire as part of my duties," he said. "Of course," Holmes replied. "And do you also carry this?" He stepped forward and, with delicate precision, reached to the inside seam of March's coat collar. From beneath the fabric, he extracted a tiny glass vial, scarcely larger than a thimble, stoppered and sealed with wax. Even through the fog-laden air, I caught the faintest sharp tang. Lestrade swore under his breath. March's restraint shattered, though not into panic. Rather, his eyes hardened into something cold and resentful. "You meddling fool," he said, not to Lestrade, but to Holmes. "You have no idea what you are interfering with." Holmes's expression did not change. "On the contrary, I have a very clear idea that men connected with the auditing of gas contracts have been targeted, that funds have been diverted through false invoices, and that someone with authority over street infrastructure has sought to silence those who noticed." March's jaw tightened. "You see only fragments." "Fragments," Holmes agreed softly, "which assemble into a shape." Lestrade gestured to his men. "Take him." As they moved to seize March's arms, he did not resist. Instead, he laughed once, a short, bitter sound. "You believe you've solved it," he said. "You think I act alone, that I risk my position for a handful of coin." Holmes's eyes sharpened at once. "I believe nothing without proof, but I suspect that an assistant inspector's salary would not justify so elaborate a method. Tell me, Mr. March, who benefits most from these false invoices?" March's gaze met Holmes's, and in that locked exchange there passed an unspoken acknowledgement. The first move had been countered, but the game was not finished. "You will never prove it," March said quietly. "Not without access to the original contracts." Holmes's lips curved faintly. "You mistake me again. I do not require the contracts. I require the pattern of alteration." He turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, Mr. March's lodgings must be searched immediately. You will likely find materials for the preparation of these vapor devices, perhaps ledgers, correspondence, drafts of invoices. But I caution you, you may also find evidence pointing beyond him. Lestrade frowned. Beyond? Holmes nodded. March is positioned conveniently. He possesses access and knowledge, but the scale of the embezzlement implied by multiple false contracts suggests a superior hand, someone within the board itself, with authority over approval and disbursement. March's expression betrayed a flicker of unease. Speculation, he said, though less confidently. Holmes regarded him steadily. Is it? The anonymous warning, 2 more before Sunday, was addressed not to the victims, but to Mr. Hargreaves, a secretary. Why? Because the writer wished to create panic within the office, to hasten the closing of inquiries before the audit reached a certain stage. He paused. Your actions have been precise, Mr. March. Efficient, yet the warning was theatrical. That suggests another mind, one that enjoys manipulation. For the first time, March's composure cracked visibly. Lestrade seized the moment. Enough talk. You're coming with us. As they led him away down the lane, swallowed gradually by fog and constables alike, Holmes remained motionless, his gaze fixed not upon the retreating figure, but upon the lamp-post itself. Well? I asked quietly. Holmes exhaled slowly. We have secured the instrument, he said, but not yet the conductor. You think March is not the principal? I think, Holmes replied, that he is both guilty and insufficient. We began to walk back toward the broader thoroughfare, the fog thinning slightly as evening approached. The gas lamps burned steadier now, their halos widening. Consider, Holmes continued, that March had access to lamp posts and chemical knowledge. But the false invoices required approval at a higher level. A mere assistant inspector could not divert substantial municipal funds without cooperation. And the victims, I pressed. Slate and Bellamy. Both clerks engaged in examining discrepancies, Holmes said. March could identify them through his association with the contracts. But who alerted him that suspicion was tightening? Who knew precisely when the audit would expose the fraud? I felt a chill not born of weather. Mr. Hargreaves. Holmes shook his head at once. Too anxious, too transparent. No, Watson. The true architect remains within the board. Calm, observant, perhaps even assisting in the investigation while guiding it away from himself. As we reached the main street, Lestrade rejoined us briefly. March will be held, he said. We'll search his rooms tonight. Holmes inclined his head. Do so, and discreetly review the recent approvals of gas supply contracts. Pay particular attention to those signed in the last quarter. Lestrade scowled. You've a name? Not yet, Holmes replied, but I have a narrowing circle. When the inspector departed, Holmes turned to me, and I saw in his eyes not triumph but deepening calculation. The fog, he said softly, is lifting, Watson, and when it clears entirely, someone far more cautious than March will realize that his pawn has been captured. He paused, glancing back once more toward the lane where the lamp-post stood innocent beneath its flame. And men who fear exposure, he added quietly, are capable of far bolder moves than those we have yet seen. The following evening found our sitting room at Baker Street occupied by a company more varied than comfortable. Inspector Lestrade stood near the hearth with an air of guarded expectancy. Mr. Elias Hargreaves sat rigid upon the edge of a chair, his fingers locked together so tightly that the knuckles blanched. Beside him, pale but resolute, was Mr. Arthur Bellamy. At the far side of the room, impeccably dressed and outwardly composed, stood Sir Reginald Morcant, chairman of the Board of Works Subcommittee on Street Illumination and Gas Regulation. Sir Reginald was a tall, silver-haired gentleman of distinguished bearing, his manner measured and urbane. Though he had agreed, after some persuasion from Lestrade, to attend what Holmes had described as a clarification of recent misunderstandings. Edwin March, under guard but no longer defiant, occupied a chair near the door. His eyes rarely left Sir Reginald. Holmes stood upon the rug, hands lightly clasped behind his back, the lamplight catching the keen angles of his face. The fog outside had thinned to a faint veil. London, for the moment, breathed more freely. "Gentlemen," Holmes began, "we are gathered to conclude a matter that has troubled not only the Board of Works, but the city itself. 2 men were attacked under cover of fog. One, Mr. Percival Slate, died. The other, Mr. Bellamy, survived by fortunate intervention. Both were engaged in examining irregularities in gas supply contracts." Sir Reginald inclined his head gravely. "A tragic business," he said. "The board has been deeply distressed." Holmes's gaze rested upon him with quiet intensity. Indeed, distressed enough, perhaps, to wish the matter concluded swiftly. Lestrade shifted slightly, but said nothing. Holmes continued. The method of attack was ingenious. Small cylindrical devices affixed to lamp posts released a volatile irritant. In heavy fog, the vapor descended and lingered at breathing height. A passer-by would experience choking, irritation, collapse. In most cases, death might be attributed to weak constitution or inclement weather. He turned slightly toward March. Mr. Edwin March possessed the technical knowledge and access to affix such devices. He was apprehended in the act of retrieving one. All eyes moved to March. "I do not deny my involvement," March said quietly, that his voice stripped of earlier arrogance. "But I did not conceive it alone." A silence followed, charged and brittle. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Just so." Sir Reginald's expression remained serene. "Surely you do not imply—" "I imply nothing," Holmes interrupted gently. "I demonstrate." He moved to the small writing table and produced several documents. "These," he said, "are copies of recent gas contracts approved by the board. The invoices reflect payments to a particular private supplier at inflated rates. The approvals bear your signature, Sir Reginald." "Routine matters," Morcant replied smoothly. "I sign many documents." "Of course," Holmes agreed. "Yet the handwriting upon the false invoice amendments differs subtly from your usual signature. The flourish is heavier, the pressure deeper. It is, in fact, consistent with the handwriting upon the anonymous warning sent to Mr. Hargreaves." Hargreaves gasped softly. Sir Reginald's composure tightened. "You accuse me of forging my own signature?" "I accuse you of enjoying precision," Holmes replied, "and of underestimating the scrutiny of a trained eye." He stepped closer. "The warning, 2 more before Sunday, was not merely a threat. It was a prod. You wished to accelerate the audit's closure. Panic would discredit the clerks and redirect suspicion toward some madman exploiting the fog." Sir Reginald's gaze flicked involuntarily toward March. Holmes saw it. "Mr. March," Holmes continued, "was your instrument. His position granted him access to lamp posts. His chemical knowledge enabled the devices. But the embezzlement, substantial and systematic, required authorization beyond his station." March's jaw tightened. "He promised me advancement," he said hoarsely. "Said the board needed men who could act decisively." Sir Reginald's voice hardened. "You have no proof beyond speculation and the word of a disgraced subordinate." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary. When we searched Mr. March's lodgings, we found not only materials for the vapor devices, but correspondence, unsigned yet written upon paper bearing the same watermark as the warning note. Instructions couched in cautious phrases, references to maintaining discretion and protecting mutual interests." Lestrade stepped forward. "And we traced payments from the supplier in question to an account held under a trust bearing your family name." The stillness that followed was absolute. Sir Reginald's face drained of color, though his posture remained rigid. "You overreach," he said, but the certainty had left his voice. Holmes's tone softened, not in sympathy, but in finality. You devised an elegant scheme, Sir Reginald. Inflate contracts, divert surplus funds. When clerks noticed discrepancies, silence them without spectacle. The fog provided concealment. The lampposts, opportunity. You relied upon the city's indifference to weather and misfortune. He paused. But you overlooked one detail. Sir Reginald's eyes flickered. You assumed that death in fog would arouse no pattern, yet repetition is the enemy of secrecy. 2 clerks, identical symptoms, identical proximity to municipal infrastructure, and a warning too artful for a mere assistant inspector. March lowered his head. Sir Reginald's shoulders sagged slightly, the aristocratic facade cracking at last. You cannot understand, he said quietly. The board bleeds money. Politicians demand results without resources. I merely adjusted the balance. By killing men who sought honesty, Holmes replied evenly. Sir Reginald did not answer. Lestrade stepped forward. Sir Reginald Morcant, you are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud and for complicity in murder. As the inspector placed a hand upon his arm, Morcant straightened once more, though the dignity seemed hollow now. I did what was necessary, he muttered. Holmes watched silently as both men were escorted from the room. When the door closed, and the tension seemed to drain from the air itself, Mr. Hargreaves exhaled shakily. I trusted him, he whispered. Holmes turned to him with unexpected gentleness. Trust is not foolishness, Mr. Hargreaves. It is merely misapplied when placed in the wrong hands. Bellamy rose. You saved my life, Mr. Holmes. Holmes waved the gratitude aside as though it were an inconvenience. Circumstance saved you. I merely hastened it. When our visitors had departed and Baker Street had returned to its familiar quiet, I found Holmes at the window once more, gazing into the thinning mist. The fog has lifted, I observed. For now, he replied. You anticipated him from the beginning, did you not? I asked. Holmes shook his head slightly. I anticipated that March was insufficient. The true criminal in such schemes is seldom the man who risks the street. It is the man who risks nothing, who signs papers in comfort and lets others carry the hazard. He turned toward the mantel, idly adjusting a chemical retort as though the affair were already relegated to memory. London, he continued thoughtfully, is a city of layers, Watson. Beneath its fog lie ambition, greed, desperation. Remove the mist, and you see only brick and stone, but the currents beneath remain. I could not help but feel admiration renewed. And what of the board? I asked. They will appoint another chairman, Holmes replied dryly, and issue statements of reform. Institutions, like cities, are remarkably resilient. He seated himself at last, lighting his pipe with deliberate calm. A clever scheme, he mused. Ingenious in method, flawed in psychology. How so? He enjoyed the warning too much, Holmes said. Vanity, Watson, is the faint scent that betrays even the most careful criminal. Outside, the final wisps of fog drifted away, revealing the steady glow of gas lamps along Baker Street, lamps that now seemed less ominous than before. Holmes leaned back, eyes half closed. Come, he said lightly, as though the deaths and deceptions of the past days were but trifles. Surely somewhere in this city a problem remains unsolved, and I confess I prefer my adversaries without the assistance of meteorology. I laughed softly, though I knew well that beneath his modest dismissal lay the keenest intellect of our age. Thus ended the matter of the London fog conspiracy, another instance in which my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, dispelled not merely a criminal plot, but the very mist in which it sought to hide.